we are with Colonel Butcher at Marchfield, doing our first take, our rough draft of the sound lesson. And we are asking the question, what does SAM mean?
SAM, 2 o'clock low.
SAM means surface-to-air missile.
And what is a surface-to-air missile?
The surface-to-air missile that we faced in Vietnam was developed by the Soviet Union in the 1960s. It was primarily designed to go against the B-52 Stratofortress strategic bomber, high altitude. The SAM missile was provided to North Vietnam back in the mid-60s. And at that time, the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy were flying fighter strikes in on key targets in and around Hanoi and Hai Phong, as well as other locations throughout North Vietnam.
And what does AAA mean?
AAA is anti-aircraft artillery.
So in the recording, we can hear people saying SAM and AAA. Is that the same thing?
It is. The SAM calls were primarily put out through an agency called Red Crown, which was a U.S. Navy cruiser sitting in the Gulf of Tonkin off of North Vietnam, watching the surface-to-air missiles launch from both Hanoi and Hai Phong.
So why do we hear the call AAA?
AAA is just a shortened version. Some of the AAA was able to reach to altitudes of the B-52, 35,000 feet, while other smaller units could take on the fighters that usually flew at lower altitudes.
Now, when you were in the B-52, like the one that's behind you here, when you were in the B-52 during the 11 Days of Christmas, you were in the navigator's position. Could you see the AAA and SAMs or only hear them?
Could only hear the calls coming in, both from our crew itself, the pilot, co-pilot, or from the electronic warfare officer who had indications on his various pieces of electronic equipment, as well as calls from outside the aircraft, from my cell of 3 B-52s or from other aircraft that were part of Operation Linebacker 2.
Okay, now we're going to move on to the sound of the spoon rest radar. Explain to us what spoon rest radar is.
The spoon rest was part of the SA-2 guideline missile system. The SA-2 really had 3 parts to it. 1, an acquisition long-range radar. 2, a closer-in fire control radar that guided the missile, and then the missile itself.
So the spoon rest radar, what exactly, or can you explain what that sound is an indication of? For those of us who don't know how this works, what's happening?
Well, the radar is either sweeping a full 360 degrees, normally it's in that kind of mode, or a sector mode where they're looking in a specific direction, an angular direction in the sky for targets. And they're looking, one, for the azimuth or the direction from that spoon rest radar, and the distance and the altitude the aircraft is at. Spoon rest was usually good up to about 150 to 300 miles, depending on the version that you had. You could do spoon rest radars integrated with the missile system, or they could be standalone as search radars looking for the aircraft over your airspace.
So you could be approximately 300 miles from where an SA-2 was located that was trying to find your aircraft?
Trying to find and look at predict the direction we were going in, and the altitude we were at and airspeed, etc. So they could be passing that information into the close-in fire support, SAM, and AAA sites.
So when you were flying into Hanoi or over Hanoi or a couple of the other locations, how long would it take to bridge the distance of 300 miles?
We were flying at that time approximately 600 miles an hour. We had some very strong tailwinds ultimately over North Vietnam. So if you're looking at 300 miles or down to 150 miles, you're looking at 15 minutes to 30 minutes.
From target.
They would have knowledge of the direction you're coming from, approximate range, and speed. They could tell as they painted you in that search spoon rest radar mode.
Okay, and last but not least, Colonel Butcher, we've talked about SAMs and AAAs coming from the SA-2s on the ground and what the call sounds like in the plane. We've talked about spoon rest radar detecting the plane up to half an hour's distance away, 300 miles. And now please explain what fan song radar is.
Fan song is the missile control aircraft acquisition and targeting radar. It has a distance of 27 miles effective range with the missile. They can control the SA-2 guideline missile out to that distance and to an altitude of about 50,000 feet.
So if your B-52 was lower than 50,000 feet in the air, but within 26 miles, it was within missile range.
27 miles is kind of the maximum distance for it, but the heart of the envelope is anywhere from 10 to 15 miles, and they would wait, meaning the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft regiments would wait till you got in to about that approximate distance, and we were flying approximately 35,000 feet. We had different altitudes on different missions. Once they picked you up, and of course we were jamming those radars. They have what's called an uplink radar. Once they lock on the aircraft with the uplink radar, you know they can go to a track on the missile and guide them to you. So that was one area we were always listening for if anybody was calling uplink within our aircraft or our other two aircraft within the cell.
So when the fan song radar is heard, does that mean that the missile has locked on to your aircraft?
The sound is very similar to a rattlesnake, and the rattle is what you hear. And once you hear that in your headset, the electronic warfare officer is looking to jam that particular radar frequency. And these days, 1972, the systems were very manual in nature, where you had to place the jamming strobe over the acquisition radar frequency, and the North Vietnamese could move their frequencies out from under that. So the EW had to check back and forth to see that we were still accurately jamming that particular uplink signal.
So the actual correct chronological order is that a B-52 would come within 300 miles of airspace, and the spoon rest radar can then begin detecting the presence of the B-52, followed by, once that B-52 is within approximately 26 miles in the span of, say, 10 to 20 minutes time, then the fan song radar can lock on and the SA-2 launches SAMs towards the B-52. How am I doing?
The normal process was the B-52s were inbound to Hanoi or Haiphong in the target areas for Operation Linebacker 2. The North Vietnamese would be scanning the sky for where the B-52s would normally come from. And they could pick you up anywhere from 150 to 300 miles out, and they will feed that information through to their anti-aircraft SAM and artillery sites. They would give them an approximate range, altitude, and speed. As it came in closer to where the Fansong radars would start to be effective, which was from 27 miles into the target area, the Fansongs sometimes would come up and try and lock on to the aircraft, and then they would fire the missile when it was much closer into the target, especially with what we called the lethal SAM line within that range, which was 2, 3, 4 miles from the target, where invariably the SA-2 Fansong radar could burn through the jamming that a number of the B-52s had, and then they could go to auto track, lock you up, and fire what is a Mach 3, 2,000, 2,500 mile an hour missile.
Colonel Butcher, I want to thank you for your time today and for your service.
Thank you.
Sam, 2 o'clock low.